Hello, welcome to part 2 of our lesson on Galatians 2 verses 1 through 10. As we started last time, this biographical sketch reports on a second trip Paul took to Jerusalem together with Barnabas and Titus to confer with the recognized leaders there, James, Peter, and John. One significant outcome was their refusal to circumcise Titus, and you can see the previous video for that. Another outcome, detailed in verses 6 through 10, was agreement between Paul and the Jerusalem leaders on a ministry plan, according to which Paul would concentrate his evangelizing efforts on the Gentiles, while Peter would concentrate on the Jews. This English translation of verse 6 makes it sound like Paul is denigrating James, Peter, and John, I think. I would suggest, as for those who are recognized as important. James, Peter, and John were rightly recognized as pillars of the Jerusalem church. You can contrast that with the false brothers in the previous paragraph. But still, Paul didn't need their approval for his divine message to be legitimate. But even though Paul's divine message didn't need their approval, it did have their agreement. While the false brothers wanted to add circumcision to the gospel, James, Peter, and John added nothing to Paul's message. They concurred with Paul's law-free gospel. Instead of trying to compel him to change anything, they recognized that his message and his ministry were from God, and they agreed upon a division of duties to carry out common work together. There's a remarkable repetition of the word pair Jews and Gentiles in verses 7, 8, and 9. First, in the leader's recognition of Paul's divine calling to preach among the Gentiles and Peter's to the Jews. Second, in God's activity through Paul's ministry to the Gentiles and God's activity through Peter's to the Jews. Third, in their division of labor between Paul to the Gentiles and Peter to the Jews. This wasn't to say that Paul couldn't tell Jews about Jesus and Peter couldn't tell Gentiles about Jesus. Rather, there would be a division according to emphasis. Paul and Peter's message would be the same, but its presentation to the Jews as the fulfillment of God's Old Testament promises would take a different form from its presentation to the Gentiles who weren't steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures. As an example of the difference in presentation between Jewish and Gentile audiences, you can compare Paul's preaching to Jews in the synagogue in Pisidian Antioch, that's in Acts chapter 13, compare that to his preaching to Gentiles in Lystra in Acts chapter 14. So why does Paul tell the Galatians about this arrangement? Well, we could imagine that his rivals who were trying to persuade the Galatians to a different gospel that consisted of Jesus plus the law, that they might be arguing that Paul had gone rogue and was preaching a different message from the apostles in Jerusalem. By telling them about this meeting, Paul was proving to the Galatians that he and the leaders of the Christian church in Jerusalem were in fact on the same page and were working in concert with one another. Again, we see Paul emphasizing both his independence of the Jerusalem church on the basis of his divine message, as well as his unity with the Jerusalem church on the basis of that same divine message. We'll wrap up with the Jerusalem church's request that Paul continue to remember the poor in verse 10. In part 1 of this lesson, I suggested that this visit to Jerusalem might be the same trip described in Acts chapter 11. There, the prophet Agabus predicted a famine, and in response to that prediction, the Christians in Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas to the region around Jerusalem with financial gifts. If that's the case, then this conference between Paul and the Jerusalem leaders was precipitated by an effort to help the poor. By asking Paul to keep it up, James, Peter, and John weren't only looking out for the Christians in their region, they were also encouraging a manifestation of the unity of the Christian church that transcends Jew and Gentile identity and transcends every other difference between people. So that's it for this section. In the next episode, we'll read Paul's last biographical sketch, which recounts a later conflict between Paul and Peter. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer. And if you find these lessons helpful, please give them a thumbs up below and share with your friends. See you next time.